Most people think this is just a knife, but the handle alone tells a completely different story. And no piece, no item is perfect. And that's where the real conversation starts. So here on the table, we have another of my many seaxes, or in English, a knife. And I've owned this one for over 25 years. In fact, I bought this in 1999 when I took up the hobby of being a Viking Norse reenactor. And I love this knife. I think it's probably my second favourite seax. And the only reason why is because of this handle. And I love this handle. So, my second favourite seax. Where does the name seax comes from? Well, the name seax comes from the Anglo-Saxons, the people of the knife. And this is a very good example of a museum quality piece with the typical broken back style and the slightly tapering in the blade. And this seax was such a common weapon. In fact, I do believe the seax was the most common weapon found in graves in the Anglo-Saxon age of England. And spears are second. Although some people do debate that. There's been research that says actually spears are more common, but I would say the knife is more common because everybody needed a knife. A spear is very specific. It is used for hunting. It is used for fighting. This is your Swiss Army knife of the Dark Ages. With this, you can do so many things. You can cook. You can cut animals up. You can butcher. You can do woodworking, carving. You could eat your dinner with it. You could carve your nice bit of beef or venison. Not with this one, because this one is blunt. And it's blunt for a reason, because this is a combat blade. Now, I love a good seax. So let's talk about the design, first of all, of the knife itself. Well, the knife will have a tang, which is in here. In fact, you can just see the bottom of the tang here, where it's just come through. And it will slightly taper in. It will start thick at this end and narrow down. And then we have the broken back style, where it slightly tapers in. And I love this style of blade. In fact, I've had this blade for many years. I've used it in a lot of combat because it feels nice in the hand. It's so important when you fight, what you're fighting with feels nice. Because if it doesn't feel nice in the hand, if it feels awkward, you're not going to want to fight with it. So this fits in my hand so perfectly. And this is because of the stack ring handle we have here, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And again, on the knife itself, there's a fuller or a blood groove. And again, this has been put in either after the manufacturing of the blade, whether it was forged on a forge, I don't know. And the fuller is there to basically reduce the weight. And if it was put in during the blacksmithing stage, it would also push the blade out slightly in the width. But I predict this one is probably being made afterwards to suit the knife. And you don't always see fullers and blood grooves on seaxes a bit like this one, which is just plain. But we've already talked about that knife. And today we're talking about this one. And I think it's just absolutely brilliant. So the fuller is a very important part of a sword or a seax. And most swords would have a fuller, but a lot of seaxes didn't. Now I know this typically as the Norwegian style of seax. And that is because of the handle itself. But I'm up to debate on that because I'd love to see some evidence of wooden turned handles like this being used in Norway. I would say that handles like this were very rare, but would be commonly used throughout Europe and be turned on lathes because they had the ability to turn wood. In fact, over the years I've made many of these handles, but this one you can see something slightly different because you can see the wear. You can see how much it's been worn, the polishing of the wood. And it slightly tapers in the centre and tapers out at each end. Originally, there would have been a metal cap like this one, made of iron, on the back end of it. But at some point during its history, it has come off during combat, has been lost on the battlefield. I like to think one day a metal detectorist going along in a field will find it, well, probably with some Anglo-Saxon reproduction coins as well, and would wonder how old it is. And at some point I need to get some iron and make a new ring for the back, but we'll talk about how we can improve this knife later on in the video. So I am very much open for debate whether this is the Norwegian style of sax because of the handle, or whether it's more unique, whether it was more readily available throughout Europe and especially in Anglo-Saxon England. And I must say, it's a lovely little knife. The handle is roughly 5 inches long, so you're looking around about 12.5 centimetres. And the knife length on this is just shy of 9 inches, so 8 inch and 3/4. So we're looking, let's just convert that into metric for you. Give me a minute. So you're looking about 17.5 centimetres in length, roughly. And I just think it's a wonderful, wonderful item. So let's talk about the grip. So you can see, as I bring it up, the grip has been turned on a lathe. It is made from ash, and you can see over the years it's got a few cracks, which which is fine. The stable is not cracking any worse. I could always repair it with a little mounting or bond it back on, so there's always the option for that. Like I said, it slightly tapers in the centre so that it fits a little bit better in your hand rather than feeling like it's parallel, and it also prevents the knife from slipping out of your hand because of the fact that it tapers out at the back. It gives your hand something to hold on to, and I assure you, it won't come out of your hand very easily. And like I said, I expect this is an old piece of ash, and this is probably over 30 years old, this knife. Could even be older than that, could be 40 years old. It could date from the 1980s. I'm not overly certain of the date, but we'll talk about where I got it from and how much I paid in the future. So if anybody has any evidence of Norwegian knives and Langsaxes having this style of handle and being known as the Norwegian style, then please do let me know, because I'm very up for debate on that. I'd like to see some more evidence. So let's talk about the materials. Firstly, of the knife. Any typical Anglo-Saxon or Norse knife of the time, or sax, will be made from iron. And if you're very lucky, you may have an edge of steel, which will be fire welded in during the process of forging the knife, which I do assure you is a very difficult technique to manage and get used to, and take some skill, because you need to add flux so it melts in when this metal, the iron, is so hot and the steel is so hot. When you hammer them together, it melts and forges together. I've seen people do that, and I've done it myself, and it is a skill to have. And again, wood handle, ash, most probably, could be oak, but I think this is ash. An iron ring with 2 little iron nails to keep the ring on. And this is the problem this ring had. This ring should have been nailed on, but it wasn't, because there's no witness marks or holes from where nails have been. So it was probably made to have a very close fit and probably knocked on, so it wouldn't come off, but it has. And when I bought this, I don't think it had the ring on at the back. And at some point I will replace it and add one. And let's talk about the sheath as well, because the sheath, again, is an important aspect of any knife. It is made from a nice brown veg tan leather. It has got 2 straps. Now you will notice something about these 2 straps, is that one is longer than the other. And we'll explain that further in the video, so do keep tuned. And if you are new to the channel, please do consider subscribing. Now around the edge of the knife is a band of copper. Now this has a few reasons to be there. First of all, it adds rigidity to the back of the sheath, and actually you can see it's slightly bent. It needs straightening back up again because they do bend over time. And then we have 2 washers on either side and a very nice domed rivet, and it's been properly riveted on the back side. And this may be stitched inside, or it may not be stitched. I'll probably never know that, because I don't ever intend to take it apart. And you can see, it's old, it's been used, the leather needs a bit of work. Perhaps these straps could be a little bit more tighter on the fitting. Some people like them loose to move about, and some people don't. That is your own personal preference. Personally, I like it to be a little bit tighter, but also loose enough so that I can move it if I wanted to. But it's not the most important aspect of this knife, for it's a knife itself. And again, anybody with a little bit of skill can make one of these. It's just copper leather and copper rivets, and for modern washers. Would they have used washers back in the day? Well, yes, because if you rivet through and you don't have a washer on, then what could happen is your sharp rivet can actually cut through the leather, and this is how your strap comes off and you lose your knife in battle. So the idea of the washers is to give strength and to ensure it never falls apart. And you know, this could be embossed with some nice design. If I make a new one, I might think about doing that in the future and demonstrate that on camera when I teach myself again. And you can definitely tell it's old with all the wear. And in fact, it's a bit dry. It could do with oiling up. And I just love the smell of leather. It's such a wonderful, wonderful thing. And at some point I'll put a stitch in, but again, we'll talk about that later on. So let's talk about the strap design. Why are these two loops or straps, why is one shorter and the other one longer? Well, to explain this, we'll need to put the knife back first of all. So let's put the knife, the sax, back into the sheath. Then we'll grab a Norse or Anglo-Saxon bolt. In this case, it's Norse because we have a strap end of Odin. Hail the All-Father. So we're going to get the bolt out. And the first thing we're going to do is feed the buckle through the bolt. Just bear with me as I do this. It's difficult some days to talk and do things at the same time. So what you'll notice is this end will hang lower than this end on the bolt. So this end is slightly tighter, and you always have it on the right side and not the left side, because most people's left hand would be used for the shield. There was probably no such thing back in the Anglo-Saxon times as left and right-handed people, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that. And did they know that people were right-handed and left-handed? Probably to a certain degree. So the idea of having it on your bolt and having a strap longer is so the left side of the knife end hangs lower, and then the handle is slightly higher on the bolt, so you can grab it quickly and attack the Anglo-Saxons or Normans or Norse warriors you're fighting. If you, for instance, lose your sidearm or your spear. And I've seen this in a few occasions. In a few of my saxes, this side is always longer, but I've also got other examples where this side is equal in length. Again, it's down personal preference. I could take it apart and I could, you know, make it the same length, but I won't, because I want to keep the heritage of this knife the way it is. And again, just for to let you know, the bolt is made from veg tan leather, and is a bolt that I'm going to talk about with another knife in another video. And that's that part of the knife. And we always carry the knife, again, I must state this, Anglo-Saxon and Viking saxes were always carried parallel to the bolt. Again, we can see this in a number of illustrations from the Bayeux tapestry, but also the rectum stone demonstrates this, and that's currently in, and is in Derby Museum, which I will make a video about in the future. So let's talk about the balance of the knife, because the last knife I didn't talk about that, because every knife will have a balance point, a point where it will sit equal on your finger. And this is why we have a good handle, because a handle adds to that balance. If we had no handle, a small or very light handle, the balance point would be further up. So in this case, it's right about there. I'll just tweak it a little bit, and then eventually it will balance on my finger. So another reason for the handle is to give weight to the back of the sax to make it balance, and this is especially true in swords, because without a good pommel on a sword will be top heavy. So it reduces that top heaviness feeling as well, which is another important aspect of the knife. And you know, it's such a lovely thing, and you definitely need that balance to influence you attacking and using it. I'll definitely use swords that are unbalanced and they feel awkward in the hand. You know, the pommel feels too heavy or the sword feels too heavy. So you've got to get the balance right. And again, this is another skill of the craftsman or craftswoman, for instance, who made this. So, craftsmanship. This demonstrates not only the ability of modern craftsmen and craftswomen to make such extraordinary things. Couldn't quite get my words out there. But it also demonstrates the crafts of the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, because this is pretty much, I would say it's about a 90% accurate copy for a knife of the time. But like I said, I'm very much open to debate for how rare these were, because I think most handles would have been quite plain, made from antler, bone or wood. I've got examples of all three, and I've got a few examples of these wooden turned knives. And in fact, one day when I get my lathe going, I'm going to make and demonstrate how you make these on a wood lathe. Because you may not know this, my trade as a craftsman is actually a centre lathe turner, which I spent many years working at Rolls-Royce and for companies like that in the engineering business. And you know, excellence and quality, that's what Rolls-Royce is about. And this, again, is like the Rolls-Royce of seaxes, because it's such a quality item. Now, does it ring? Now, here's an interesting question. So, no, it doesn't ring. So it's not been hardened perfectly to give it a ring inside. But also, what can happen over time when you get a knife that does ring, when you start using it, because of all the impact damage from the fighting you do, it can actually, you know, weaken the blade and knock the ring out of it. But I expect this blade probably never had a ring. And in fact, I don't have many knives that do ring. But again, this is made from a spring steel, so when you're fighting, it's not going to damage and blunt the knife too much. And what we have to do in reenactment scenes is to always make sure your knife and your sax is lovely and clean. And we always carry one of these blocks, and maybe we'll carry a file, because some days you have to file down the edge as well, especially when you get looked at by a master of arms or a training officer, because generally they always check your weapons out and make sure they're fit for combat. Because the last thing you want on a knife is a sharp burr and you attack somebody and it bounces up and hits the arm and they're not wearing anything on the arm and it cuts them. In fact, I had that happen to me in battle once, when somebody, when I was fighting a guy called Whiff, and my sword bounced off from the top of his shield and hit his cheek and slightly cut his cheek. But that did not stop the battle, because he was absolutely loving the fact that blood was pouring all over his face. But that's another story for another day. So, yes, the rarity of this item. I think this is quite a rare item. I don't often see wooden turned handles. So the maker. Now, when I brought this, and this was brought again, I think off Thorolf, if I recall, he told me that he brought this from Paul Binns. It's one of the very early Paul Binns saxes from the early or late 80s, but I could be wrong. And again, there's no maker's mark or nothing. If you made this and you've seen it on camera, then please let me know. So, how long have I owned it? How much did I pay for it? So, again, I bought this in 1999, in round about December, I think, just before or just after my birthday, and I paid £20 for this knife, which I thought was a reasonable amount. Now, how much would it be worth today? Well, you're probably looking between £60 to £80, but I think I could probably get more for it on eBay if I ever sold it, but I won't do. It may go to the grave. One day, you know, it may end up in the British Museum, as I often think about donating. When I die, I'll order my kit to the British Museum as an example of a modern reenactor portraying the Norse, because I think it's fascinating history. So what does this say about your status and my status? Well, this says that I am a wealthy warrior. I've got coin, I've got money, I own land, I can afford a knife. But again, without repeating myself, it also represents your freedom. So authenticity versus comfort. Like I said, I would say this is 90% accurate for the time. And I think that's a very fair assessment of the blade. And I'm fairly open to the fact that this is an authentic handle. I'm fairly certain in the past I saw an archaeological find that looks a little bit like this from the late Iron Age. So I expect wooden handles like this go way back in time. Who knows, they could even go back to the Bronze Age, and you know, when they had lathes. But you know, I'm not an expert when it comes to that period of history. And again, having a knife, and when you choose a knife, you go to a reenactment traders fair, or you're on camp and somebody's got them for sale. It's so important that it feels right in your hand. If it feels loose, if it doesn't feel right, if it feels like it's going to slip out like this one would, because there's not much of a grip. This is quite loose, but this one, that's solid in my hand. You can't get a better grip than that. This one, loose, could slip out your hand. This one, not loose. So I definitely choose this one every time. So what needs improving on this knife? Well, first of all, you could do with polish. Make it look really shiny would be nice. It needs another mounting, a ring of iron around here. I could then either have a solid cap with a back, or I could put a nice brass or copper or silver plate on the back with a little bit of design as well, if needed. And then on the sheath itself, you got these domed rivets, which are modern. So at some point, these need hammering down to make a little bit more authentic looking, like they're being worked on with a hammer. And in fact, one day I will make a new sheath for this knife, but I need to practice my crafting skills off camera before I feel confident enough to, you know, make a new one. And apart from that, you know, you could polish the copper. I could definitely put it on my anvil and straighten it, because it is slightly curved. It's definitely curving this way and that way inwards. But that's because of the use and the wear. It's got a slight crack happening down here. This will have a crack and it's being folded over. You could actually solder that together if you need to be, but I won't. Again, the leather could do with treatment. It could do with some oil. You know, never stop oiling your leather. You should always oil your leather 3 or 4 times a year, ideally. And again, we'll talk about that in another video on how to treat and look after your leather. Because if you don't look after your kit, if you leave this in the garage or the shed and you forget about it, it will go rusty. You know, the handle will go mouldy, and if you leave this outside in the damp conditions, then it will go mouldy again, and the leather will deteriorate. So you have to look after your kit. Now, one more little thing, one little tip and hint. You got a sax, and you're going into battle, but it's got a habit of getting loose and dropping on the floor. They do now and again. So what you could do, and I probably will do, is put a little bit of a stitch here, one stitch going around, which will tighten it, so that I can actually get the knife out and not being too loose, because at the moment it's just too loose. And this has come out and dropped on the floor a few times whilst fighting, because, you know, you're running about in the battlefield. These will loosen with the movement, and gradually it'll come out, and before you know it, it pops out on the floor, and, you know, your knife is 20 yards behind you, and when you need it, you don't have it. So, and then what you could do with this stitch, you could actually stitch it and have a little bit hanging off, put a little bit of a bead on it and tie a knot at the end, so it's got a little bit of a bead for decoration. And I think at some point I will demonstrate doing that on camera. So there you go. This is my second favourite sax at the moment. It may change. If you have any questions about this knife, then please do let me know. If you have any suggestions for videos in the future, again, please do let me know. Until the next time we meet again, it is goodbye from me. It is goodbye from Braggy. And today I've dressed up with some Viking bling and also a tunic. Although you can see my modern sleeve underneath. Naughty Braggy, must hide that. But I thought I'd put a little bit of decoration on, make it look like a little bit more authentic with my hands. And at some point I will refilm these videos with me in person talking about it. But for now, we're concentrating on close-up looks, but you don't get enough of these on the internet, and so many people will be appreciative of having that close look at these lovely and fantastic weapons of history. Please do subscribe and please do leave a comment. It's goodbye. Now time for the end screen. If you like my sax and you like to fight Normans and Saxons and Norse warriors, then please do give us a like. Let's just reposition this for the thumbnail. There we go. I don't know why I left my pen on the table. That's my pen for notes, and it's got a weird monkey on it. Made a mistake there, didn't I? I'll be getting comments about that. What's that weird pen with that monkey on top of it? Goodbye.